In the summer of 1227, in a military camp somewhere along the banks of the Liupan Mountains in northwestern China, the most powerful man who had ever lived closed his eyes for the last time. No dramatic deathbed scene. No recorded final words that historians can actually confirm. Just gone. And in his absence, an empire covering 12 million square kilometers, stretching from the Pacific coast of Korea to the Caspian Sea, from the frozen edges of Siberia to the scorched plains of Persia, an empire larger than any that had existed before it, and larger than any that would exist after it for centuries, began almost immediately to come apart. Not in a single dramatic collapse, in something slower and more corrosive than that. In the gradual fragmentation of succession disputes, in the competing visions of sons and grandsons who each inherited a piece of the whole and then spent generations fighting each other over where the borders of those pieces should fall. Think about that for a second. The largest contiguous land empire in human history, held together by the force of one man's singular organizational genius and the loyalty systems he spent a lifetime constructing, began fracturing within decades of his death. Historian Timothy May, one of the foremost scholars of the Mongol Empire, has argued in his work, The Mongol Empire, a historical encyclopedia, that the seeds of fragmentation were built into the Mongol succession model itself. The Kurultai, the great assembly of Mongol nobles who elected each new great Khan, was simultaneously the source of the empire's legitimacy and the mechanism of its eventual dissolution. Every contested succession drained resources, reshuffled alliances, and pushed the constituent parts of the empire slightly further from a unified center. And here is where it gets strange. Genghis Khan knew this. The administrative reforms he introduced in the final decade of his life, the codification of the Yasa, the Yam postal relay system, the appointment of sedentary administrators from conquered populations to manage tax and supply. All of these suggest a man who understood that brute military conquest was not the same thing as durable institutional control. He just ran out of time to finish the architecture. So here is the question that changes everything. What if he hadn't? What if the man who built the most powerful military machine the medieval world had ever seen had lived another decade, long enough to install a succession mechanism robust enough to hold? What if the Mongol Empire, instead of fracturing into the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate, and the Chagatai Khanate and the Yuan dynasty, four rival successor states that spent as much energy fighting each other as they spent governing, had instead remained unified under a single administrative structure, continuing to expand, continuing to absorb, continuing to integrate? What does the world look like then? Not just the 13th century, not just the medieval period. What does the world we are living in right now look like if the Mongol Empire never collapsed? Stay with me, because the answer is genuinely not what you think it is. The first thing you have to understand, and this is the part that popular history almost always gets wrong, is that the Mongol Empire was not simply a military phenomenon. It was an administrative experiment of staggering ambition. Scholars like Jack Weatherford, in his extensively sourced Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World, have documented how the Mongol rulers actively promoted trade across the full length of the Silk Road network, guaranteed safe passage for merchants through what was called the Pax Mongolica, established standardized weights and measures across conquered territories, and created a degree of commercial connectivity between East and West Asia that the ancient world had never seen before and would not see again for centuries after the empire's dissolution. The 13th century Venetian merchant Marco Polo traveled through Mongol-controlled territory for decades in the 1270s and described a system of roads, relay stations, and commercial infrastructure that contemporaneous European observers found almost unbelievable. And right, this is the part that I cannot stress enough. The commercial network the Mongols maintained was not incidental to their empire. It was structural. The Yam relay system alone, with its estimated 50,000 horses and thousands of stations across Asia, represented an investment in connectivity that had no parallel anywhere else on Earth at that moment in history. Now, in the unified Mongol timeline, the one where the empire does not fragment after 1227, the one where a durable succession mechanism holds the whole enterprise together, that commercial infrastructure does not collapse. It expands. Demographic modeling based on trade flow data from the Pax Mongolica period, analyzed by economic historian Abu Lugod in Before European Hegemony, suggests that the integrated Mongol trade network was already generating commercial exchange volumes between 1240 and 1260 that dwarfed any preceding era. The Black Death disrupted those networks catastrophically in the 1340s. But in a unified Mongol empire with centralized disease response infrastructure and an existing relay system capable of transmitting information thousands of kilometers within days, the historiographical consensus, including work by medical historian Ole Benedictau, suggests that epidemic containment would have looked very different than the catastrophic failure of response that actually characterized the fragmented successor states. Look, this is speculation, and I want to be honest about that. But it is speculation grounded in what we actually know about how integrated administrative systems perform relative to fragmented ones in epidemic response contexts. And here is where the implications start to genuinely expand. Because the Black Death in the world we actually live in did not just kill between 30 and 60% of Europe's population. Estimates that translate to somewhere between 25 and 50 million people dead in less than a decade, which is a number so large that it is almost impossible to feel correctly. It also restructured European society in ways that created the specific preconditions for what historians would later call the Renaissance. Labor shortages drove up wages. Surviving peasants gained unprecedented economic leverage. The Church's authority was devastated by its failure to explain or contain the catastrophe. Intellectual inquiry began to move haltingly away from theological frameworks and toward empirical observation. In the unified Mongol timeline, none of this unfolds in the same way, which means, and follow this chain carefully, the Renaissance, as it actually occurred in Europe, almost certainly does not happen on anything like the same timeline. This is the part that gets me every single time I work through it. If you're finding this completely upending everything you thought you understood about how civilizations develop and why the modern world looks the way it does, subscribe, because this is exactly what we do here every single week. We go this deep. We follow the evidence wherever it actually leads. Now let's talk about what the unified Mongol Empire would have done to the Islamic world, because this is where the alternate timeline becomes almost impossible to fully process. In our actual history, the Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258 under Hulagu Khan was one of the most catastrophic single events in the history of Islamic civilization. The House of Wisdom, the greatest repository of scientific, mathematical, and philosophical knowledge in the medieval world, was sacked and burned. Historians estimate that the destruction of Baghdad's library system represented an intellectual loss comparable to the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, and in some domains, including mathematics and astronomy, the scholarly consensus recorded in work like Dmitry Gudis's Greek Thought, Arabic Culture, suggests the losses set back the transmission of certain knowledge streams to Europe by a generation or more. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had served as the political and intellectual center of Islamic civilization for 5 centuries, was obliterated in a matter of days. Here is the thing, though. In the unified Mongol timeline, this does not happen the same way. Or rather, it happens, but under centralized authority. The aftermath is radically different. Mongol rulers across the empire's history demonstrated a striking pragmatic tolerance for the intellectual and religious institutions of conquered peoples when those institutions served administrative or commercial functions. The Mongol rulers of Persia and the Ilkhanate actively patronized Islamic scholarship even as they suppressed Islamic political authority. In a unified empire, one without the internecine conflicts between the Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde that actually consumed enormous Mongol military resources in the 1260s and beyond, the administrative absorption of the Islamic scholarly class becomes something far more systematic. The House of Wisdom scholars, instead of being scattered or killed, are integrated into the Mongol bureaucratic apparatus, the way that Chinese administrators had been integrated earlier. And this matters enormously, because Islamic mathematics and astronomy in the 13th century were operating at a level of sophistication that Europe would not reach for another 200 years. A unified Mongol Empire that actively preserves and integrates that intellectual tradition, rather than accidentally dispersing it through conquest followed by political chaos, is an empire with access to scientific infrastructure that the fragmented medieval world simply did not have. And just to be clear about the timescale here, we are talking about what would have been a divergence point roughly 800 years ago. 800 years is longer than the entire span of recorded American history by a factor of 4. The compounding implications of a 200-year acceleration in mathematical and astronomical knowledge preserved within a unified administrative structure that already had the best commercial and communications infrastructure on Earth are genuinely difficult to fully model. But the direction of the implication is not ambiguous. In the unified Mongol timeline, the specific chain of events that produces what we call Western modernity, the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the age of exploration, does not unfold in the same order with the same actors along the same geographic axis. European exploration of the Atlantic becomes far less strategically significant when the land routes between Europe and Asia are functioning, integrated, safe, and commercially vibrant. Columbus's 1492 voyage was explicitly motivated by the closure of those overland routes following the collapse of the Pax Mongolica and the rise of the Ottoman Empire. In a world where those routes never close, where a unified Mongol administrative structure continues to guarantee safe transit for merchants across 12,000 kilometers of connected road, there is no commercial pressure driving Atlantic exploration. Which means there is no 1492, or at least not the 1492 we know. Think about what that means for the Americas. The civilizations of the Americas, the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, and hundreds of smaller polities across 2 continents, developed in complete isolation from the Old World for 10,000 years. In our actual history, their encounter with European explorers was catastrophic beyond any scale that is easy to communicate. Disease alone, smallpox, measles, influenza, carried by Europeans who had spent centuries developing partial immunities that indigenous Americans had no exposure to, killed between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas within a century and a half of contact. Historian Charles Mann, synthesizing peer-reviewed demographic research in 1491, estimates that the pre-contact population of the Americas was somewhere between 40 and 100 million people. Within 200 years of 1492, that population had collapsed to perhaps 10 million. That is not a statistic. That is the largest demographic catastrophe in recorded human history. Primary sources confirmed it. In the unified Mongol timeline, this does not happen. Or at least not in the same form, not on the same timeline, not driven by the same actors. European maritime powers do not develop into the global hegemonic force they became in our world. Because the commercial logic that drove European expansion, the search for routes to Asian markets, is satisfied overland. The Americas remain isolated for potentially centuries longer, which means that when contact eventually does occur, it occurs in a world where the technological and institutional gap between Old World and New World civilizations is potentially very different than it was in 1492. Potentially, and I want to be clear, this is modeling, not certainty. A world in which that contact is far less catastrophically asymmetric. And somehow the implications get larger from here, not smaller. Because if we follow the unified Mongol timeline forward, past the 14th century, past the 15th, we are looking at a world in which the nation-state as we understand it does not emerge in the same form. The specific political unit that came to dominate our actual world's modernity, the European sovereign nation-state with its fixed territorial borders, its monopoly on legitimate violence, its bureaucratic apparatus of taxation and military conscription, emerged in direct response to a specific set of conditions: the collapse of unified imperial authority across Europe, the fragmentation of the post-Roman political order, the commercial pressures generated by Atlantic trade, and the military competition between rival states that drove the development of gunpowder weapons and standing armies. In a world where a unified Mongol imperial authority maintains continental-scale administrative integration, those conditions do not exist. The nation-state, the fundamental political unit of the world we live in, is potentially replaced by something that looks more like an empire of regions, a federated administrative structure governing by ethnic and commercial logic rather than by the fiction of ethnic homogeneity that underlies the modern nation-state concept. And right here is where it gets philosophically uncomfortable, which I told you was coming. Because the nation-state, for all its catastrophic capacity for war and exclusion, also produced something that the Mongol administrative model, for all its commercial sophistication, struggled enormously to generate: political accountability to govern populations. The Mongol Empire was, at its core, a system governed by a conquering elite for the benefit of that elite and the commercial networks it protected. Democratic governance. The idea that political authority derives from and remains answerable to ordinary people did not emerge from imperial administrative traditions. It emerged from the specific tensions and pressures of the fragmented, competitive European state system, from city republics fighting for commercial independence, from peasants leveraging post-Black Death labor scarcity, from merchant classes demanding legal protections for property and contract. In the unified Mongol timeline, those tensions, the productive tensions of political competition and commercial rivalry between genuinely independent polities, do not develop in the same way, which means that the specific intellectual and political tradition that eventually produces liberal democracy, individual rights, and constitutional governance does not emerge on anything like the same timeline, or possibly at all in anything like the same form. The world of a surviving unified Mongol Empire might have been a world of extraordinary commercial connectivity and scientific preservation, and also a world of persistent authoritarian governance, where the vocabulary of individual political rights simply never develops the way it did in our fragmented, competitive, catastrophically violent, and somehow also remarkably generative European political tradition. This is the part that I find genuinely haunting when I think about it too long. The world we actually live in, with all of its profound injustices, its unfinished projects of equality and dignity, its still fragile and still contested democratic institutions, is the product of a specific chain of accidents and contingencies that begins with the death of one man in the summer of 1227 in a military camp whose exact location we cannot even confirm. The democracy you might live under, the rights you might invoke, the institutions you might trust or distrust or want to reform, all of it traces back through a chain of connected contingencies to the fragmentation of an empire most people only know through the legend of its founder. And the research actually shows something even more vertiginous than that, because the unified Mongol timeline is not obviously better or obviously worse than the one we actually inhabit. It is simply different. A world of preserved Islamic mathematical knowledge, of sustained commercial connectivity, of potentially less catastrophic contact with the Americas, and also a world without the political traditions that eventually produced democracy, without the competitive pressures that drove scientific revolution, without the specific catastrophes that paradoxically accelerated certain forms of human freedom. The contingency runs all the way through. There is no clean version. There is no obviously correct branch. There are only the specific irreversible choices that were made, and the specific irreversible world that those choices produced. Before we close this out, drop a comment and tell me which part of this changed how you think about the Mongol Empire, or about what the modern world actually required to exist. I read every single one. Because here is what I keep coming back to after going this deep into the research. We live in a world that was not supposed to look like this. Not because some better version was stolen from us, and not because some worse version was narrowly avoided, but because there was no supposed to. The world we inhabit was assembled, piece by contingent piece, from the specific decisions and accidents and catastrophes of specific people in specific moments, moments that could have gone otherwise at any point, and almost certainly would have if a single man's life had extended by a decade. 12 million square kilometers of conquered territory, an administrative machine of extraordinary sophistication, a commercial network that connected the Pacific to the Mediterranean, all of it, every piece of it, held together by the force of one man's specific genius and the specific succession model that genius failed to fully resolve before it ran out of time. And in the gap between what he built and what he failed to secure, the entire world we were born into quietly, irreversibly came into being. Documented. Primary sources confirm it. And somehow, that is the most extraordinary thing of all.